Hey there, I've put together this tutorial that should fulfill all your neon sign needs inside of After Effects, and this includes instant conversion of silhouetted assets into outline versions, but also animation, so like turning on, turning off, the flickering that happens in between, and also any animated signage that you may like. This is done all without any plugins, and it's 100% built-in effects. So let's go. So to start this process, I'm going to create a neon input composition where we can import all our silhouetted assets and have them converted into outline versions in the future. For now, I'm just going to have this 1920 by 1080. And I'm going to have it run for about 10 seconds long. This is where you can throw in any assets that you want to be made into a neon sign. For now, I'm going to type in open, and then on the next line, 24/7. Just going to center the line, that one. For text, having it slightly wonky is actually a really good look for neon signs, and I'll take you through how I can achieve that pretty simply. We're going to create a text animator here, so just opening up and hitting that animate button, and we're going to affect the position. I'm also going to add to this text animator one a rotation property too. Here, I'm just going to specify about 2 along the x-axis, but around about 6 or so for the y, and then the rotation here is going to be about 7, and that's going to affect it uniformly at the moment. So what we're going to do is, instead of using a range selector, I'm just going to delete that. I'm then going to go add a wiggly selector instead. The wiggly selector is going to take these values and put them in the positives and the negatives and just assign them to letters somewhat randomly. And on by default, they're going to wiggle all about, which is quite a neat effect, but I'm just going to turn the wiggles per second down to 0 so they remain static. Much nicer. If you don't quite like how your letters are laid out, you can always move around the spatial phase just to get them to wiggle a little bit. What I can also recommend is, right now they're all rotating at the bottom. If you go up to more options here and going to group alignment, you can change where the anchor points are pretty much for each letter. And you can just move this up so that these little crosshairs start appearing in the middle of your letters. It's going to change by whatever font you're using, but in this case, -27 seems to put it somewhere towards the middle, somewhere like that. -35. And while you're here, you might as well add in some extra shape effects. In this workflow, we're not very committed to how our final design looks like here. We can always just jump back in and change it later on, which you'll see in a bit. But for now, this will do. Just make sure none of your assets are black, because otherwise the next step in the process is not going to work too well, but pretty much any color is going to work just fine. I'm going to right click on this existing composition and make a new comp from selection. I'm just going to go up to composition settings here and call it outlines instead. The next step in the process here is to find the edges of all these assets so that we can generate a nice neon sign out of them. The first thing that we're going to do is add a CC toner effect. This is just the way I go about using fill colors, essentially. I'm just going to set the midtones to be white after I've changed the tones to be solid. Now, I haven't used the fill effect in quite some time because I just find the CC toner effect a lot better because when you use the blend with original, it goes between its original state and the new state, as opposed to fill, for instance, that when you've got a color and use the opacity, it just fades out the entire layer. I just like CC toner, it's a lot more flexible. So you're going to be seeing me use that a lot, but you can just go ahead and use fill when appropriate, whatever suits you mostly. The CC toner here, making it set to white, is just going to be nice and easy for when we add a solid composite. We're going to change the color here to black, and that's because originally here, we don't have any background to this composition. We just had transparent pixels, and solid composite helps just to fill in the background and just make sure everything is, black and white. And that leads us straight into our third effect here, which is find edges. Surprise, surprise, it's going to hunt down all those edges now that are nicely and clearly defined inside of our composition. Very cool. The only thing about this effect is that it makes some quite jagged edges around here. So we're just going to apply some extra effects to help smooth it out, round it out a little bit, and just make an overall better outline. Before we can do that, we're just going to add the extract effect so we can get rid of this white color here. We're going to make the white point all the way down to 0, and then the white softness all the way up to 255. That's just going to leave us with a pretty shabby kind of cutout of the entire layer, but it's good enough for now. I'm then going to duplicate the first CC toner effect here and just drag it down to the bottom just so it fills in all those pixels. Now that we have a nice cutout that is purely white, we can add a simple choker effect to it. And we can set this one to be -1. And this effect essentially pulls in and pulls out the alpha channel. And by going into the negatives, we keep expanding its borders until you get a bit too far and it goes off the deep end. But -1 seems to pad out the lines just that little bit. One of the things to note is that if you're not working in full resolution, the simple choker effect can get a little bit wonky and can start not representing what the final look is. So just be cautious of that while you're working. So now we've got a pretty nice outline of all our assets that were originally silhouetted. If you've got any already neon ready fonts or assets, you can just drop them into this composition here and position them where you want. And anything that you've got silhouetted, you can just put in here. So for instance, this works really well with, say, logos. If you've got a logo here, I'm just going to make it white so you can see it a bit easier. If you've got a logo here like our chunk logo, you don't want to have to generate the outlines from this, but you're able to just position it somewhere inside of the composition and it will spit out the outlines version automatically. No worries whatsoever. Okay, so let's make this thing glow now. I'm going to right click on the outlines composition and make a new comp from selection. Here I'm going to go up to the composition and call this neon glow. Just so our neon is sitting on something, I'm going to bring in this picture of bricks that I've sourced from pexels.com, a great website for free stock images. And this is going to be a great starting point for our neon glow. Just going to make sure that it all positioned well. It looks pretty good as is. But just to make it a bit darker, you don't need it in bright daylight. I'm just going to add a color balancer effect, which is a lot like the hue and saturation effect. But again, I have a preference to this one because you're able to animate the hue a lot easier than the other one. I'm going to turn down the lightness of this image to around about -87-ish and desaturate it to about -45, just so that we've got a nice contrast between everything. We're going to be seeing the bricks a lot easier once we start adding these glows to bring back in the light, so this is a good starting point at least. Just going to rename my outlines comp here to main glow, just so we got our first effect kind of figured out. I'm going to add the glow effect to it. Couple of effects, we're going to be duplicating this a bunch of times and just tweaking some of the settings just because it's pretty much the only way that you're able to make a somewhat realistic glow without any plugins. I'm going to change the color threshold to 0, the glow radius to 20, and the intensity to about 0.3. Barely noticeable so far. But then if we duplicate this effect, it starts to pick up, and we're going to triple the radius here to 60 instead, so we start to spread it out. Duplicate it again. Instead of 60, we're now going to set 180. And for the last one, another instance, duplicating that one, I'm going to 540. And now you get a nice glow without any kind of extra plugins. It's a bit tedious to set up, but it works just fine for now. I'm then going to add a CC toner effect to this stack. I'm going to change it from tritone to solid again. It's going to look awful for a little bit, but trust me, it's going to get better. And then you can just specify a color that you want to kind of produce. The reason we're using a CC toner effect at the end of our effect stack rather than specifying the colors beforehand and letting that glow or specifying in the outlines composition is because of the way that the glows use the additive blending mode, and it forces these RGB colors to stray from the original specified colors. For now, we're just going to stick with one color for all these neon signs, but towards the end of the tutorial, I'll show you how to have multicolored. Now that our layer is colored, all we have to do is change our blending mode of our main glow to add, and we start to see our bricks a little bit more easier now. So now that we got a nice glow here, I'm going to drag in another instance of the outlines composition and place it underneath the main glow, and I'm going to call this fill glow. I'm just going to hide the main glow composition for now, just so we can see the process a bit easier. What this fill glow is going to do is just kind of fill out the composition a little bit more with a bit more of diffused light so that it just looks a bit more pleasing. First effect that we're going to apply is a simple choker effect, and I'm going to set that to -10. And that's just going to fatten out all these lines dramatically, just so that when we add a fast box blur after it, we've just got a bit more pixels to work with. I'm going to set the radius to be 200. We're just pretty much going to lose the entire semblance of our composition now. But then we can add in a curves effect. And the curves effect is really handy because underneath the channel, we can actually affect the alpha just like you would in a layer's luminosity. What I'm going to do is just go and drag up this middle point just a little bit, somewhere in between this little box here, just to brighten our image a little bit more and give it a bit more life. What I'm going to do here now is then assign a toner effect. I'm going to change the tones to be a solid once again. And then I'm going to link the colors between the main glow and the fill glow so that when we change one, the other one changes. I'm going to select both layers, and up in the little search box here, I'm just going to type in midtone. And here we can bring up both of the CC toner effects. And I'm just going to pick whip the fill glow to the main glow so that they both become blue. Then to finish it off, we can change the blending mode from normal to add, just to brighten it again, and bring back the main glow. It's going to be a little bit overwhelming for a bit, but that's okay, we can tweak that in time. I'm going to then bring in another composition of the outlines. I'm going to name this one Neon Tube. We've got our two glows now, and I want to kind of maintain that original hot middle tube of the neon sign. I'm going to add the simple choker effect now and set it to a positive number this time, just so it brings it in a little bit. And you'll see here that when we go from the negatives to the positive, it just tightens it up, kind of restricts just how many pixels can be shown, which is a good start. And then I'm going to add a fast box blur after that, just to soften it out, so we just kind of simulate a kind of roundness to this shape instead. I'm going to add the blur to radius to be about 1, just so it's a bit softer. I'm going to add another glow effect to it, just to kind of glow a white color rather than this blue color. And I'm just going to make the threshold be 0, the radius be 15, and the intensity being 0.5. It's going to have this kind of black halo effect around it, which is super not ideal, but that goes away as soon as we change the blending mode from normal to add. Much nicer. If you're finding your glows a little bit too hot like mine is at the moment, you can go back to your main glow here and adjust the midtones color in your CC toner. And here, what's really powerful about this is that if you're finding it a bit too hot, you can control the intensity of the glow by moving it down. Eventually, if you move down to black, of course, there's nothing to glow. But you're able to just kind of move this about until you find a nice healthy medium. You go off further to the right, you'll get a nice richer glow. You just move it about until you find something that looks good to you. I'm going to bring in another outlines comp and drop it at the bottom of our stack here, but above the bricks. And I'm going to call this Original Tube. And this will serve that when our glow is turned off or it's flickering, we've got the base kind of tube still there. That would give some kind of indication that there is a neon sign there, it's just not turned on yet. I'm going to add the CC toner effect. I'm going to set it to a solid and pick the mid-tones to be just a nice dark kind of gray. About 14% brightness here. I'm just going to hide these glow layers for a second so you get to see the effect. I'm going to add a fast box blur of about 0.2 just to soften these edges out a little bit, and again to kind of create that roundness. I'm going to add another CC toner effect on top of this, once again changing it to a solid. I'm just going to double click on the midtones because I'm going to link this to the main glow. So again, we change one, it changes all of them. If we double click on the midtones, it's going to bring it up in our timeline here, and I'm going to select this little pick whip and drag it to the midtones of our main glow here. So it takes on its original color. But the nice thing here is that if we up the blend with original to around about 80% or so, we get a nice little faint kind of recognition of the original color without it being overly dominant. The last thing that we'll do to this for now, we'll right click on it and add a layer style, and it being an inner shadow. It's going to open it up down at the bottom here in our timeline, inner shadow. I'm going to change this to normal because we're going to make it a white color instead. I'm just going to tone down this brightness here to about 15%, angle it so it's coming in directly from the top, so a 90, and then a distance of 2 and a size of 2. And that's just going to round out our tubes a little bit. So before and after, just going to make it so it's kind of like a 3D effect to it. So yeah, once that's done, we can unhide these layers and you barely notice that it's there at all, but once we start animating, it will shine through. Now that we've got a lot of glowing, I also want to include some shadows, because right now it just feels like we've applied glow to some outline text on top of a wall, but by adding shadows, we get to feel like it's planted up against the wall instead, and I feel like that's going to be the edge that we need to make this look realistic. I'm going to drag in another instance of the outlines. I'm going to call it Neon Hard Shadows. I'm going to add the CC toner effect again. Once more, solid. I'm just going to bring this brightness down to around about that 14% again. I'm going to add a fast box blur. I'm going to set this radius to be about 1 for now. Then the transform effect. This is going to help us offset the layer without having to, physically move the layer itself. What I'm going to do here is specify that the scale be 98%. I like this look instead of just using a position move because it's a bit more extreme on the edges and kind of brings everything into like kind of perspective. It's a really cool effect. But at the moment, it's right over the top of our layers of our original tube, so we can remove that quite easily by adding the set matte effect here. Right now it's going to prop it to just be the neon tubes, which is not ideal. But if we invert the matte here, we get to remove the shadows wherever the neon tubes are, and it only shows through where the neon tubes aren't. So we just get this kind of nice drop shadow effect onto all of our neon tubes here. The last thing that I'll do here is reduce the opacity to around about 35%. We start to get this kind of distinction that it's casting shadows because the tubes still are going to be physical objects and cast shadows. The glow is not going to reach everywhere. And this is a pretty good start to making it feel like it's up against a wall. I'm going to drag once again another instance of outlines, put it underneath our neon hard shadows and call it neon soft shadows. I'm going to add the CC toner effect, set it to be solid. Pick a nice dark color again. This one can be probably a little bit darker, around about 5%. Going to add the simple choker effect just so we fatten out these lines because we're going to blur a bit more harshly so we get these nice soft shadows. So I'm going to set it to -2 just to fatten them out a little bit. I'll then add a transform effect and set the scale to be 98 again because it's quite a nice effect. I'll also move it down by 10 pixels, so 550 in my case, just so we offset it a bit more. I'll then add a fast box blur set to be around about 6 in the blur radius, so we just get this kind of more soft diffuse look to it all. And once again, it's overlapping our neon tube, so we can use the set matte effect, which is assigned to itself. Then if we invert the matte, it avoids the tubes entirely. Again, it's a little strong, so this one I'm going to turn down to around about 25% also. But this may be a bit different from whatever kind of neon tubes that you're making. Tweak around with the shadows until it looks good for you. I might turn mine up to 35% because it looks pretty good in this case. So that's pretty much the setup for our neon signs for now, before we get into the animations. But I also want to take you back into our neon input composition because this is the really fun aspect for me, is that we can change any of these little shapes here. We can scale them up, we can move and rotate angles, whatever you want to do, and it will automatically be updated inside of our main composition without having to do any kind of extra masks or paths or any kind of animation. If we go back into the neon glow, it's going to update automatically. All the shadows are going to take effect, all the outlines are going to happen. I just feel like it's a much more dynamic and free way of working. But no neon sign is done without any kind of flickering effect to it, and it'd be rude not to do it. So what we're going to do here is make two different methods of animating it. We're going to be able to animate each asset individually so they can flicker by themselves, but also be able to turn on and off the entire neon sign in one go if we want to. The first thing that we'll tackle is the blackout, which is turning on and off the entire composition in one go pretty much. I'm going to do that by going up to Layer, New, and Solid, to create a new black solid the size of our composition. I'm going to call this one Blackout. Now you could just adjust the opacity of the neon input composition, but if you had any other assets in here that were already outlined, they wouldn't also take effect. And I just find this is a much easier process. Now what you could do here is just affect the opacity of this layer to turn the composition on and off, but unfortunately you're introducing a bunch of black pixels when it's being fully turned on. What I can recommend instead of doing any kind of alpha mattes or anything funny business like that, what you can do is change its blending mode from normal to silhouette alpha. That pretty much means it's now become an alpha matte, but for everything underneath it in one go. So now that when you animate the opacity of this layer, you get to fade in and out the original layers underneath it without introducing any kind of other pixels or any kind of background to them, which is really handy. I'm going to right click on this opacity slider right now for the blackout and add the property to Essential Graphics so that we can access it in the comp above. That's going to bring up an extra window here called Essential Graphics, and I'm just going to call this blackout instead of opacity, so it's a bit clearer. I'm going to drag in my existing black solid that I have up in my project now. I'm going to drag it underneath and I'm going to call this flicker. I'm also going to make this one as silhouette alpha, and just so we can actually see something, we're going to turn down the opacity of our blackout layer. I will also do the same for our flicker layer just so we can see what we're working with. And what we'll do here is pretty much mask around all our individual assets. And this is where we start to stray that once we start modifying the neon input, we're going to have to start modifying some other things, but it's worth it in the end. I'm just going to go through now with my mask pen tool and just going to be drawing around each and every asset in this scene. Lovely. Once you got all the masks set up, I'm going to add 2 slider controls to this solid here. The first one's going to be called flicker probability, or just prob for short, and the second one's going to be called flicker max. The flicker probability is just going to be set to 32 now, so what that means is essentially it has a 1 in 32 chance of flickering on that frame. And the flicker max is just how much opacity can it be adjusted by, and right now I'm just going to set it to 50, so it only goes down to 50% brightness. Now the way that we add the randomness to it is we go into the masks and just open up the first mask that you've got there at the moment and add an expression by alt-clicking on the mask opacity stopwatch next to it to enable expressions. I'm just going to back up what we've got there originally. I'm just going to type in opacity equals, open up a brackets here, random, open up the brackets here, and this is where we're going to stipulate what we're randoming to. I'm just going to pick whip our flicker probability slider that we have up here in the effects controls. Great. And then if this property here, I'm just going to, now we've got a lot of brackets here, we want to be positioned between the last brackets and the second last bracket. I'm going to add the less than symbol and the equal symbol. So if our probability is less than 1, if we randomly manage to get less than 1, then we get to affect the slider. I'm going to add a question mark here, so this is pretty much an if statement now, and I'm going to go random, open up the brackets now, and pick whip the flicker max. So what it will do now is that if our slider does end up being less than 1, it's going to randomly pick a number between 0 and 50 and reduce its opacity by that much. At the very end, after the last bracket, I'm going to add a space and a colon here, and then stipulate 0, and finish off with a semicolon. So this is pretty much saying that every time it isn't less than 1, which is a majority of the time, the mask is going to be set to 0% instead, which means we get to see our layer. So we can just click out of that now. Nothing really changes because our flicker layer is currently set to 0% opacity. If we increase it now, you'll see that at the moment, our star is shining through, which is wonderful. What you can do now is right click on the mask opacity that you just added the expression to and go copy expression only. I'm just going to go through each of the other masks now and just paste it over the top of the mask opacity for that mask. Great. So now when you scrobble through, you'll see that they all start flickering sporadically pretty much by a certain amount, and you get to change just how often this is by reducing the slider. So if it's only set to 3, there's a very high chance they'll be flickering and off they go like wild. But you also get to stipulate just how much they're able to fade, what's the maximum amount. So when it's set to something close to 100, they're going to be essentially turning off as well, so which is great for when they're turning on and off, but set it to around about 50 or so and you just get a bit more of a subtle effect. It's going to bring those back to the original values. I'm now going to right click on the flicker probability slider and add this to the essential graphics. I'm just going to rename this to something a bit more clear. I'll also do the same for the flicker max. So with that done now, we can go back into Neon Glow and we'll get all these essential properties for all these layers so we can get to fine tune them, because of course we don't want the original tube or any of the shadows to be affected by the flickering. We just want it to happen on some specific layers. So for instance, for the original tube, I'm just going to open it up and open the essential properties. And for flicker max, I'm going to set that to 0. So even if it would flicker, it's not going to change the opacity at all, which means it's not going to flicker at all. If we go into the neon soft shadows, we'll do the same here. Open up the essential properties, flicker max to be 0. Likewise for the hard shadows layer, flicker max be 0. For consistency's sake, what we can also do now is link all the glow layers to the neon tube so that all the essential properties here change at the same time. So we're not animating 3 at once. Just going to pick whip the fill glows, blackouts, flicker probability, and flicker max to the properties found in the neon tube. And I'll do the same for the main glow as well. Now for the actual animation, I found this to look pretty nice. I'm just going to start on 1 second here because it's nice to have it be turned off for a little second. I'm going to animate the blackout here to start at 100%. As we turn that up, you'll see all our glows disappear and we're just left with our shadows and the original tube as well. Now over the course of about 6 seconds or so, I'm going to turn this blackout from 100% down to 0% so it's fully turned on again. But what I'll also do is animate just the intensity and the frequency of the flickering. So I'm going to, just a couple of frames after that last blackout keyframe, initiate the flicker probability and flicker max. And then over the course of about a second or so, add some extra keyframes at the end. So this is its final resting place where it flickers occasionally. But then on these initial keyframes here, I'm going to make the flicker probability to be about 3. So it's going to be flickering constantly. And then make its flicker max to be about 100. So with that, this is what the effect looks like. It's like a fluorescent light turning on. It's got the kind of crazy moment to begin with while it's all kind of initiating and starting up, but then it gets to be a bit more steady towards the end. What I find as well is that some of these flickers are a bit too intense, especially like those ones there. So what I'm going to do is just reduce the flicker max here to be about 30 or so. What I've also noticed when I was first creating this is that the glow itself is very bright compared to the tubes itself. Like back here, the glow is pretty much at 400%, but the tube itself isn't white hot yet. So I was wanting to try and fix that. And I need to come up with a fix and I'll show you to you now. It's going to happen on our main glow layer here. I'm just going to collapse all these effects so they're nice and easy to see. And what I'll do is add a curves effect. I'm going to push this to the very top of the stack, and I'm essentially going to crunch the alpha channel a little bit so it's not as intense when it's just booting up. So I'm going to change the channel to alpha. I'm just going to drag this midpoint here down to the crosshair of this bottom right kind of intersection. By doing that though, we do make some crunchy edges happen, which is not ideal. And what I can do to help here is add a fast box blur that happens before the glows happen and just make it around about a radius of 0.2. And that just softens it out a little bit. But it means now that when it's turning on, it's not as intense. You can tweak this as you see fit because maybe you want a bit more extra glow here. So you can just kind of tweak this curve to suit the style. Before and after, it's night and day essentially. Of course, we can do the reverse if you're wanting to animate things out. It's pretty much going to be the same animation, but we'll just crunch down the flicker probability to not last as long here. You can recreate these keyframes to be reversed. I'm going to use the Motion Tools Script UI panel up here where I can hold down Shift and hit the clone button, and they'll automatically paste all these keyframes in a reversed order, which is very nice. But I can then just crunch these initial kind of flicker probability so it doesn't last as long. And then they can turn off towards the end. So there's our neon sign animated now. It turns on, it turns off, and it flickers throughout without needing any kind of assistance from us, which is good. But if you were after some multiple colors, this is where we get to introduce that. First thing I'll get to do here is go through and pre-comp all of these into just one composition so we can duplicate it a bit easier. I'm going to select all the layers, right click on it and go pre-compose. And we're just going to call this Neon Sign 01. Happy with all of that, so that's all committed. The other thing that we'll do now is because we've pre-comped it, all of our blending modes haven't come across. So what I'll do is just toggle the switches to bring up the continually rasterize button or the collapse transformations, whatever you want to call it, just so our blending modes come back through again. I'm going to create a folder over here just for organization's sake. Call it Neon Sign 01. And I'll put in the Neon Sign 01, the outlines, and the neon input. Just drop them into there for now. So now when I can duplicate this folder, I'll also make duplicates of all the composition side of it. And I'll just rename these so they're a bit more clearer. Then you can go through the neon input for both sign 1 and 2 and keep and remove the things that you want to be differently colored. For instance, I want to keep all these shape layers to be different colors compared to the Open 24/7 and the chunk logo, so I'm going to delete them from this composition. Inside of input neon 2, I'll then remove the other two, just so we've got the shape layers left over. The other thing to note is that while we have duplicated these, inside of outlines 2, it's still going to be the neon input 1. So what I'll do here is hold down Alt, select this layer with our neon input 1 selected as well, and just Alt click and drag over the top so it replaces them automatically. No extra work, gets to keep all the effects. And inside neon sign 2, all of these will still be outlines 1, so I'm going to select them all, select the outlines 2, Alt, click and drag, and it will replace them all at once. Very nice. The other thing I'll do here is go into the main glow and select a different color, just so we've got the differences going on. I'm going to select a nice kind of raspberry color. Nice. Now we're back in the neon glow composition. I'll duplicate the neon sign and replace it with the neon sign 02 by again alt clicking and dragging on neon sign 02 and just dragging that in. Now it's looking pretty nice. They've all preserved the keyframes as well, but you're able to animate each different color separately from one another if you want them to be turning on a little bit later or turning on and off. You're able to do that pretty easily in here. Another kind of very important aspect to neon signs is when the continuous lines are never quite continuous. There's never like a full loop. There's always this kind of break in these lines. And there is a bunch of different ways you can achieve this. You can make that everything is a stroke layer instead, or shape layers, and that you just use a little bit of trim paths on it. You can even use Disco Text, the plugin made by Plugin Everything, to automatically add trim paths to live text. You don't have to convert them to a shape layer to do that. Or you can do it in this method, which I think is the most flexible method, which is using masks on a solid. And that way you can able to just tweak it as you see fit. You're not kind of constrained by anything, but it also works now on those silhouetted assets that we added in beforehand. So in the outlines comp, I'm going to dive into here. I'm going to add another solid once again, and once again, add it to be silhouette alpha. I'm just going to turn down its opacity so we can still see our original layers. I'm going to name this one be cutouts. And I'm just going to use my pen tool now to go through each of these little sections and add little cutouts to all these letters and logos so that there's never one continuous line. Once you're done making the mask, you can bring up the opacity of your cutouts layer up again, and you'll see them all take effect. Nice and simple. You can go back into your neon glow and see the effects that it can do. And it seems to just make it a lot more realistic and a lot more neon signy. I'll now do the same for the outlines 2 comp, but yeah, I'll speed that up too. With most of our neon sign completed now, I wanted to introduce you to my favorite PNG. It was from a Video Copilot tutorial many years ago now, but he included it as just a nice little compositing thing, and it is by far the best kind of 512 pixels by 512 pixels you've come across. It's this very kind of small light spot that you could somewhat achieve with, say, a solid and some masks, but there's something very special about the way the fall off happens here rather than just a straight linear feathering that makes it really handy for some just extra light and atmosphere inside of your shots. I'm going to go back into our main neon sign composition here. I'm just going to drag it in over to our right hand side for a moment. Since it's quite smooth and straightforward, you can scale this one up quite high and you won't get any kind of quality loss until you get very large. But all you have to do is add a CC toner effect here. You can leave it on tritone for this one just so that we keep this white hot center and the blacks out here. And just change the midtones color to some kind of contrasting color to the rest of your scene. I'm going to pick a nice like warm orange here. And then I'm going to change its blending mode to be additive. You can then just kind of position this off to the side. You only want the kind of subtletiness of the this light spot, just kind of hinting at there's something else that's going on the other side. It's quite easy to just duplicate it and drag it off to the other side and shift its color a little bit. Maybe to like a purple or something like that. Play around with the scale to make it a bit softer. Something like that. I think it just does so much extra work to your scene and just adds some extra little colors here and there, but with such minimal effort. It's a great PNG. We're not quite sure how these neon signs are being powered right now, so what I recommend is we add some cabling so that they're, again, kind of rooted and makes a bit more sense to the whole scene. What I'm going to do is right click on our Outlines 1 composition here and make a new comp from selection. I'm just going to rename this composition now to be cables. Just going to drag that out because it doesn't make sense for it to be in there. I'll also drag in Outlines 2 just so we get our full scene in one go. I'm going to select both of these layers and turn them into a guide layer so that they're not shown through, but they're a nice reference for us here to be able to draw our cables. Now with the pen tool, I'm just going to start replicating some kind of cable work, just going to be hanging cables. I'm going to make sure that the fill is set to nothing and that the stroke is set to just a solid color. It's around about 5 pixels, seems to be a pretty good cable width for now, but you can, pick and choose. What I can suggest for making some decent cables is just clicking and dragging off the frame and dragging out this handle, clicking then again to where the cable will meet and just drag out that other end of the cable. Make sure after every time that you've made a shape, you don't want it to continue on, so I just click on the shape layer that it's created to just commit to that shape. Rinse and repeat for all the different shapes to make sure they're all connected one way or the other. And I'll see you on the other side. With all those done, who knows if this is the best way to set up a neon sign wiring system. I'm sure it isn't, but hey, it looks kind of nice in the end product. So I'm going to go back to Neon Glow now and drag in our cables composition to be underneath all of our neon signs. It looks awful, but here I can set add a toner effect, make it solid and pick a nice dark color, around about 5% or so. And then I'll also right click on it, add a layer style, an inner shadow, just like we did before for the original tube. Changing it to normal, white color, set to around about 10%, degrees of 90, a distance of 2, and a size of about 3-ish. And that just gives it a nice little definition to it all. Just to make it stand out from the wall a little bit more, I'm going to duplicate this layer, call the bottom one cable shadow, and I'm just going to remove the layer styles from this one because we don't need the inner shadow for that one. I'm going to add the transform effect to it and just move it down around about 5 pixels or so. And add a fast box blur. I'm going to set the blur radius to around about 3 and just have it affect the vertical since we're only going up and down. A subtle little effect, but I feel like it kind of roots it again and makes it more of a cohesive scene. Now the interesting thing about neon signs is that on occasions you will come across, say, animated signage where they flicker between 2 different states or maybe even more. And of course that's just neon tubes turning on and turning off in a kind of a sequence of patterns, but how can we recreate that in this current setup? I'm going to go into the neon input for the number 2 where we have all these shapes. I'm just going to add some basic animation to these shapes. So what I've got here now is pretty much all these shapes rotate a bit so they look like they're going from one extreme to the other. I'll also make sure that each of these are looping. I've got the Script UI panel that is free called Quick Loop, and that just makes it a bit easier to just click on this one so that they continuously go back and forwards. I've got these set up with hold keyframes just so that it kind of mimics that neon sign look. With that done now, that's going to, of course, turn into the outlines layer, but we do want to check to make sure that all of our little masks that we're done with the cutouts are still effective in the rotated version. For instance, this one is a little bit too cropped here, so I'm just going to refine that a little bit so it works on both. You could animate these paths as well if you so desire. I'm just going to add a new one to this one. Yeah, that looks pretty good. And then if we go into the main composition now, we can see them animate back and forwards. But of course, we don't have the original tubing for when the other one is essentially turned off. So what we can do is go into neon sign 02 here and then take a peek at our original tube. So pretty much our tubing is changing every second or so. So what we can do is pretty much replicate what it was looking like a second ago, and we can do that via the echo effect. If we add the echo effect to the original tube here, and I'm just going to move it all the way up to the top of the layer stack, all we have to do is tweak the echo time to be -1 second, and after 1 second we'll see the original outlines from what was there essentially 1 second ago. So if we're in the middle of between 1 second and 2 seconds, we're drawing the original what was there 1 second ago. So of course this effect only starts happening after 1 second in the composition, because otherwise there's nothing to draw back here. I'm going to copy this effect, the echo effect, and paste it into the neon soft shadows as well, so that we get the shadows consistent across the board. Do that for both of the shadow layers, put it to the top. But there is one more thing that we have to adjust if you're going to go down animated signage here. So you have to go to set matte and change it from whatever layer it was set to original tube, and make it look at its effects and masks, just so it takes into account both instances of the tubing. You can see before and after here, it was overlapping the original tubing, but we kind of want it to mesh together and pretend it's one kind of cohesive path, or something like that at least. And I'm going to do the same for the neon soft shadows, assign it to be original tubing to look at its effects and masks. So all we have to do now is start all of our animation and compositions after 1 second has passed, because that allows enough time for the echo effect to initiate and start drawing both instances of the path. If your animation takes a little bit longer, you're going to have to tweak the echo time seconds to something a little bit longer, whatever time it takes for it to capture all the instances of your animation. So I'm going to look at the keyframes under neon tube. I'm just going to push these ahead to the 2 second mark instead. I'm going to do the same now for the neon sign 01 here, and just move those keyframes to be starting at 2 seconds instead. Then under neon glow, I'm just going to move this work area to be starting at 1 second so that everything's kind of initiated. I love the look so much. The animated signage where the tubes are still there and still casting shadows, I think it really sells the effect. What I'm interested in is trying this out on some character animation, just like 2 or 3 frames to kind of cycle between. I think it's going to look really cool. Right, so the last thing I wanted to do is do some final comping work, add in some atmosphere and do a final color grade on this. So I'm going to make a new comp from selection from the neon glow composition that we're currently working in. I'm going to be working with a file from Premium Beat. It's called Slow Atmosphere, and it's a part of their fog overlay pack that they have available for free. You can go check it out and go download it. The link will be in the description below. I'm just going to drag this into our composition here. Of course, it's going to be a little bit large because they come in as 4K. I'm just going to go right click, transform, and go fit to comp just to tighten it up a little bit. I was looking for a technique here that I could colorize this layer, this smoke layer, based upon the colors of the neon glow layer, so that we don't just have like some gray smoke over the top obscuring our composition. I was wanting to color it so it felt like it was part of the environment, and I think I've come up with a pretty good technique for that. What I'm going to do is duplicate the neon glow and just move that to the top of the layer stack here, and I'm going to pre-comp both the neon glow and the slow atmosphere into one comp, and I'm just going to call this Atmos for now. Inside of that composition, I'm just going to make sure it's trimmed to 10 seconds because we don't need all that video file just yet. I'm just going to tweak this original neon glow a little bit. So I'm going to add a color balance effect here, the HLS version, and I'm just going to up the saturation a little bit just to really emphasize those colors. But then pair it up with a fast box blur. I'm just going to crank this up to around about 100 or so, just to really diffuse all those colors, and make sure you have the repeat edge pixels enabled in this case, just so that we don't have any kind of empty spots on the outside. And the key to this whole process here is changing its blending mode from normal to color. And that means all the color that exists in this layer is going to be injected to the layers beneath it. But what's in a really cool way is that it doesn't affect the luminosity of the layer, it doesn't affect any kind of alpha channels, it's just pure color populating the screen, which is really cool. The way that I'm going to get the alpha channel from this layer, you could just set it to screen. That's kind of a lame way to do it because it's kind of lightening the whole scene. It does work, but there's a better way to go about it. I'm going to add the shift channels effect here, and under take alpha from, I'm going to change that from alpha to luminance. So wherever, we just hide the neon glow for a second. So wherever there is brightness, there's going to be opaqueness, and wherever there is darkness, it's going to be see-through. So we get a nice cutout, but we don't brighten our footage in the process. Of course, since we've done that, the neon glow layer is a little bit funky now. What I can recommend is turning on the preserve underlaying transparency box next to the blending mode for the neon glow layer, so it only affects the now smoke layer. If you find your smoke layer a little bit dark, you can't see it well enough, you can add a curves effect here. You can move that above the shift channels and just push up on the regular channel here, the RGB channel, and you get to see more of it. And this, of course, happens before the shift channels, so its luminance is affected and it affects the alpha cutout that it makes. So with that done, we can go back into our composition here and take a peek at that. And I think it's really cool how it takes on these colors, starts to become more at one with the scene. Of course, you can adjust the transparency of the smoke so that it's not too overwhelming. Final thing that we'll do to this before we call it a day is I'm going to color grade it in a nice simple manner just to make it pop a little bit more. I'm going to go up to layer and make a new adjustment layer here. And I'm going to add the lumetri color effect to it. We're not going to be making many tweaks to this. We're going to just dive into creative here. And I'm going to pick the SL Clean Straight NDR. That's just going to make things pop a lot more. All the neon tubes feel a lot hotter and a lot brighter. The color is a bit more vibrant, and I think it's just a great look overall. You can also go into the vignetting a little bit and just pull down the vignetting a touch just to darken those edges. You can decide if that's to your taste or not. You can also adjust the intensity of this look so that it's a bit more extreme, or you can find a nice little kind of middle ground. I think it looked pretty good to me. And there you have it, a beautiful glowing neon sign setup that doesn't use any plugins and also has animation and automatic flickering and all of this beautiful stuff. As you would expect for your convenience, we have uploaded this template to our Gumroad for free, so you're able to download it and you can tinker around with it and try out your own things. Due to permission issues, we won't be able to share all of these assets with you inside of the project file, but rest assured there will be links for you to acquire them yourself. The link to the Gumroad is going to be in our description below. Go check it out when you get the chance. I had a bunch of fun putting this tutorial together, and I really hope that you got something out of it. Do subscribe for more motion design tutorials and drop a like on this video if you enjoyed it. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.